All right, sorry about that mix-up there, but I think we're ready to go now. Hopefully everybody does see my screen. So thank you all for joining the webinar. This webinar is being recorded. Everyone on the webinar is actually muted, so if you have any questions, there's a chat box, and we'll try to get to all those questions towards the end. So my name is Mike DePalma, Channel Development Manager with Datto. Great partnership with Ansero. We were founded in 2007. Backup and disaster recovery company based out of Norwalk, Connecticut, so about 40 miles east of Manhattan. We've been growing. Like I mentioned, we've been around 11 years. We actually protect close to 400 petabytes of data in our 9 data centers. And I'm going to get to the importance of the redundant data centers. But here in the States, we've got one in Reading, Pennsylvania, and one out in Salt Lake City, Utah. So different sides of the country. And I'm going to talk about how that will help combat some of the things that are out there. And I mentioned our partnership with Ansero. We have strategic partners all over the world. And Ansero's been a partner for several years, Blue Partner, which is our top tier partner. So the idea today is to rethink backup and really what that means now, because the landscape of backup has really been changing over the last decade or so. And for years people thought about backup as just this kind of insurance policy, second copy of your data just in case your building burned down or there was a storm, or we get another hurricane up here in the Northeast. But now really your backup becomes your last line of defense, and it has really evolved in what it can do. And so when people think of backup, and this is what most small businesses that I talk to have, they're talking about external hard drives or potentially tape backups, which we still see pretty prevalent all over the country. And then now we've seen a shift to the cloud as well. So you've got a second copy of your data, different geographical location, which is great. But at the end of the day, these are all just second copies of your data, and the criminals out there are exploiting some of the limitations of these forms of backup. So some of those limitations include higher failure rates. Some of the older antiquated backup solutions, they do just break down. I mean, some of the studies on tape backups show that failures with tape backups are anywhere in the 30 to 40% range. And so if you're infected by a ransomware attack or really any kind of hacking attack, to have a 30 to 40% chance that those backups aren't going to be available obviously is a huge advantage to the criminals. Manual testing, and that's also manually taking those backups. If you have somebody who actually has to go in and take those backups every day or every week or however often you're taking those backups, obviously you're introducing now human error. And most of the attacks that we see, they're going to exploit human error. And the same goes for the testing. Most of the businesses I talk to can tell you exactly how many times a day or a week that they're taking backups. But when you ask them how often have you been testing those, usually you get a blank stare. And people are saying, I don't know, hopefully somebody down the hall is taking those backups. So you want to take the user error out of the testing aspect as well. Slow recovery time, this is where we're going to talk about a lot in the webinar. So we're talking about that time machine, bringing your data back to the last clean backup. With a lot of antiquated kind of traditional forms of backup, that recovery time can be days or weeks. If you're using just a cloud solution, I mentioned, it's pretty prevalent nowadays, and you've got several terabytes of data. Have you ever tested how long it's going to take to bring several terabytes of data down from your cloud backup solution? I mean, you are talking about several days, if not weeks. And so the criminals are exploiting that. And I'll get into ransomware, which is the most prevalent attack that we see in the small business community. But they're going to bank on the fact that, hey, you could either pay me the $5,000 in ransom or go restore from your backup and be down for several days. The cost of that downtime is far more expensive. And then obviously just the risk of infection or theft are going to be greater when especially you have just one backup solution. If you've got your backup in the office, obviously there's a risk there. Or if it's just a mile down the road, you want to have multiple copies of your data in different geographical locations. And so the shift to business continuity, at the enterprise level, the large Fortune 500 companies, this has been around for a long time. The ability to say, okay, my systems go down, I can get back up and running very quickly. Now we're seeing solutions that are targeted towards the small business community to keep you guys up and running as well. And so some of the features of this is you want to have a hybrid solution. I mentioned some of the traditional forms of backup. It's just a second copy of your data. With business continuity, you have an on-premise backup, which is going to allow you to do file-level restores very quickly, or virtualization, which I'm going to get into in a minute. But you also have that redundant copies of your data with us in those 2 data centers. So that way, if something goes wrong on your system, you've got that local backup. If that backup is compromised locally for whatever reason, maybe you do have a fire or storm or flood, well now, you can go to the data center in Reading, Pennsylvania. Now, let's take a doomsday scenario, and whatever's impacting us up here is also impacting Reading, Pennsylvania. Well, now you've got a third copy of your data on the other side of the country. So multiple copies of your data, different geographical locations. That's very key. So that's the hybrid solution. Taking the user error out of it, making it automated, setting your schedules for as often you want to take those backups, and then having an automated testing process as well. One of the things that allows us to do the virtualization capabilities is the idea that we're taking an image of the entire server. We're not backing it up at the file level like most traditional backups do, not just the files and folders. We're actually taking a snapshot. We're capturing the files and the folders, and also the operating system, the applications, everything that lives on that server is going to be mirrored to that on-premise device, and then subsequently duplicated to those two data centers. One of the other pieces of this is that once we take that base image of everything that lives on that server, that initial backup, you set your schedules for as often as you want, and we're just taking incremental block level backups, which means that it gives us the ability to say every one of these backup points is independent of one another. Traditional forms of backup tend to layer upon previous backups. So this allows us to go back to any point in time. If you're backing up hourly, you'll see a drop down with every single one of your backups. They're all independent of one another. So if there's an infection that occurs, there's no risk of it impacting previous backups. And then ultimately, what this allows you to do is virtualize your servers. This is that component that allows you to say, okay, our systems went down for whatever reason. Maybe it is just a server failure. You're able to roll back that last clean backup and actually virtualize the server, which means that everyone who is actually, working off of that original server that's been infected or has just gone down can now work off of this on-premise device. This is now operating as your server. And even if that on-premise device goes down, you have the same capabilities from either one of your data centers. It allows you to just go back in time and keep your business up and running, not just restore your backups and restore to a new piece of hardware, truly keeping your business up and running. And these are the things that are going to help you if you are attacked. Now, the biggest threat out there right now, especially to the small business community, is ransomware. And I've been going around doing ransomware-specific presentations for several years now. And a couple of years ago, you'd get a couple head nods, a lot of people looking down at their phones. It's something that maybe they've heard of, but it's never going to happen to me. Over the last several years, as the explosion of ransomware has occurred, now people are very interested. Now it's an eye-opening experience. And so last year, May of last year, so almost coming up on the 1-year anniversary, we saw the largest single-day attack ever. Single virus, single day, impacted 220,000 computers worldwide. 150 countries were impacted. And so we've never really seen anything like it. And what was interesting about this particular infection was that they only asked for $300 across the board. A lot of these ransomware attacks, what they do is they try to gather as much information as possible about the folks that they're attacking so that they know, hey, if I hit a hospital, I'm going to ask for tens of thousands of dollars. If I hit a small business, maybe I'll ask for $3,000 or $5,000. This WannaCry attack, $300 across the board. The FBI estimates they only netted about $300,000, which may seem like a large amount of money, but they actually netted over $1 billion over the last 12 months. So this is really just a small portion. So the IT community, the kind of consensus was, okay, this was just a test. This was the phase 1. They wanted to see how many computers they can attack. And then phase 2 is, hey, we're really going to monetize this. And that was really what was kind of the consensus. And so everybody was kind of preparing for this second phase. I actually did a presentation alongside a gentleman from the FBI about 2 weeks after the WannaCry attack. He gave a very scary presentation about cyber warfare and all these different types of things. But he ended with ransomware because obviously it was the hot button topic of the day. And what he said was, we've got two theories here at the FBI. First theory, the same one I just explained. This was phase 1, so the FBI is now preparing to combat phase 2. But his second theory was a little interesting. It was something at the time I didn't really put much credence into, but as time has gone on, I really think there's some validity to this. The second theory was, these criminals didn't care about how much money they made off the actual ransom payments. And that $300,000 was just gravy. The second theory says that the entire attack was to scare the world into buying Bitcoin, which 11 months ago might have sounded crazy, but now if you've been following the news, obviously in Q4 of last year, we saw these huge, crazy fluctuations in the Bitcoin market. And so why does this matter? Why do the criminals care about it? Well, they've been perpetrating these ransomware attacks now for several years, and they always ask for the money in Bitcoin because they know it can't be tracked back to them. It's an anonymous form of currency. And so they're going to ask for it in Bitcoin because they know they won't get caught. Now, they've been accumulating Bitcoin when it was $100 for a Bitcoin, $200 for a Bitcoin. And the cost of Bitcoin has been pretty stagnant since its inception. January 1st, 2016, it was $443 for a single Bitcoin. January of 2017, it's close to $1,000. That first tick up that you see, that first blip, that's May of last year. What was happening was we had these large organizations, mostly in Europe, that were gobbling up Bitcoin because they were preparing for phase 2. And they wanted to be prepared because it's not like you just walk into a bank and buy some Bitcoin. You have to set up an account, get it funded. It could take several days. So once they started gobbling up this Bitcoin, the market kind of followed them. And we saw this huge fluctuation, actually peaked close to 20,000, but it opened this year at $15,000. And you'll see the stories in the paper about the young kid who bought some Bitcoin a few years ago and became a millionaire, or the savvy investor that got in. And those are great kind of feel-good stories. But the people that made the tens of millions of dollars, or even more than that, hundreds of millions of dollars, were the criminal community. The folks that have been gobbling up this Bitcoin through these ransomware attacks over the last several years. And to be completely frank, this is organized crime. This is not the guy in his basement anymore. This is what organized crime has shifted to. So organized crime here in the States, and Russia, and China, and Europe, this is what they've been focusing on. And so, like I mentioned, when I heard this theory back 11 months ago, I thought it was kind of far-fetched. But whether this is really what occurred or not, it made a lot of sense. These guys made a lot of money off of this, these criminals. And the scarier part is now when you're seeing that, the small business community is really just being used as pawns for larger, kind of bigger ideas. They're trying to stay 2-3 steps ahead. And the scary part about ransomware specifically is a lot of times it's not even criminals trying to make money. It's actually foreign agents trying to impact our economy in general. And one of the examples that I gave last year, which I thought was just a kind of creative ransomware attack, was called popcorn time ransomware. It was a specific variant of this attack where you'd infect the network, you get the scary red screen that says, hey, pay me my ransom, but it gave a second option. And the second option was, you could infect 2 other networks for me, do my job for me, become the criminal. Once you infect 2 other networks, I'll unencrypt your data. And so this was a story that, I went around telling folks about. And in one of my presentations, I was sitting next to a cybersecurity expert, actually a former hacker. And he said, yeah, my sources are telling me this really has nothing to do with actually making money. It's to impact and cause disruption in our economy, cause distrust. And so that's another way to look at it. And that's even scarier because the idea that you can just pay the ransom and get your data back is starting to become kind of a thing of the past. The NotPetya attack, which happened in the summer of last year, we've already figured out that the Russians were behind that, and it was targeted at the Ukraine, but it actually impacted the entire world. Anyone could have gotten impacted by this particular virus. So it's just scary to think about the players that are behind this, and how does a small business combat this? The rise in ransomware has been really exponential over the last several years. It's actually been around since 1989, the virus, but we very rarely saw it until around 2013, and then we saw an explosion. And this screen shows the more prevalent variants of ransomware out there. People have probably heard of CryptoLocker or Locky or some of the more prevalent ones, but there's actually an estimated 4 million variants of ransomware out there, and they're popping up obviously every few minutes. There's new variants popping up. So when you look at what happened in 2013, what caused this explosion, it's pretty simple. The criminals figured out that they could use Bitcoin, this anonymous currency, and marry it with this very easy delivery system of a virus like ransomware, and now they can infect a lot of networks with very little risk of getting caught, and that's really when organized crime stepped in. So this was something that we knew about. The theory that the FBI came up with last year really does tie into that, and it shows you really what's happening out there. And so the impact to the small business community, I mentioned the $1 billion. The impact to the small business community is actually closer to $75 billion, and that's because this accounts for the cost of downtime and the cost of data loss. And when you look at who's being attacked, and they're really trying to look at small businesses because they know they're using those traditional form of backups. They don't have the ability to keep their business up and running. They've got two main pieces of leverage, these criminals. The most obvious one is they've got your data locked up. So if you're not backing up your data, or if you're not testing your backups, that's their one piece of leverage. You've got no other recourse but to pay because you've got to get your data back. But let's assume, and they assume, that a lot of businesses do have a backup solution, and that they are testing it, and that they could probably get their data back. The second piece of leverage is that right-hand side of the screen. Your RTO represents your recovery time objective. How much downtime would you incur if your systems were to go down for whatever reason? Would it be hours, days, weeks? For most businesses, we're talking about several days, if not weeks, to get all that data back. And so the criminals know this. So they're going to price that at, a few $1,000s and say, pay me my $4,000, or go ahead and try to restore, and you're down for several days. The cost of that's going to be far greater than whatever you're paying in ransomware. And so, we did a ransomware study. We did one in 2016. We did another one in 2017. And the folks in the small business community, those were one bucket of folks that we asked, and we wanted to see how many people got infected and how concerned they were. But we also surveyed the managed services community, so folks like Ansero all over the world. And for the folks in the managed services community, almost all of them, 6 and 7, had at least one client that was attacked with ransomware over the last couple of years. We started the survey July 1st of last year, and just in the first half of the year, 60% of these MSPs had at least one attack. And so when you look at who's being attacked, you'll see the stories in the paper. And obviously, if you've been following the news over the last few weeks, the city of Atlanta really got hit hard with a ransomware attack, and they were not prepared for it. And they estimated that they lost $2.7 million at the time, and it's still rising. And that doesn't include all the consulting fees they're paying $400 or $500 an hour for. Doesn't include the folks that just lost productivity, they couldn't work. And this is ongoing. So you see stories like this, the hospitals, the municipalities, but the vast majority of people that are being infected are actually a small business community. Up here in Connecticut, the judicial system was hit, and cases had to be stopped. They couldn't operate without their data. And so these are the stories that are sensational and you hear about, but the vast majority of people that are being attacked are the small business community. They're going to go after the low-hanging fruit. There are certain criminals that want to go after the big whales. There's other ones that will say, I can infect dozens of businesses in a single day, get $2,000, $3,000 each from them, and do very, very well. So of that $1 billion that changed hands, over 700 million of it came from the small business community. And the average payment when we surveyed these small businesses was anywhere between $2,000 and $5,000. Now take $700 million, break it down into $2,000 increments. Now you start to see the size of this net that's being cast and how many people are being infected by this. It's pretty amazing. And of those small businesses, over half reported data loss, and 3 in 4 reported business-threatening downtime. There's an estimate, there's a study out there from the Gartner Group that says a small business that's down for a week or more, 73% of them are out of business within 12 months. That's what these guys are exploiting right now. And, when we looked at who's concerned about this, they love this statistic. Of the managed service community, just about every one of them was highly concerned about ransomware. The small business community, less than 4 in 10. Less than 4 in 10 small businesses even have this on their mind. And so criminals love this because they know that they can exploit this. And so, when you look at just kind of calls to action, what's happening out there, what they're trying to exploit is folks that just aren't understanding their risks. They're focused just on protection. And there's a lot of layers you have to put in place. But you can't just rely on all those layers because these criminals are very smart. So your firewalls, your antivirus, all of these type of things. Not testing your backups. This is coming from really any organization that you look at. A lot of the regulations that you're seeing, especially up here in the Northeast, require you to test those backups, require you to have a plan in place. Education, webinars like this. I mean, even the folks that are on here, hopefully, it's kind of eye-opening, but we're going to have the recording. Please share it with folks in your office. Make sure that they know what the threats are that are out there. That's the first line of defense. Folks that aren't looking for outside help. Folks that aren't using companies like Ansero who, are dedicated and thinking about this 24 hours a day. The folks that try to handle it all in-house typically are the ones that wind up paying because they're not well prepared. And then really most importantly, having a framework. Just like we have fire drills and we know where everyone has to go, there should be a plan in place, a disaster plan where if somebody gets infected, they know exactly what to do. The worst thing that could happen is somebody clicks on the wrong attachment, executes a file, you're infected with ransomware, and they have a panic attack and don't know who to talk to. They don't want to be blamed for this, so they just turn their computer off and try to slink away, and hopefully that works. You have to have a plan in place. When this occurs, who do you call? What are the next steps? Very critical. So to look at what this cost of downtime is and what that ability to take a step back and keep yourself up and running, let's look at a couple examples. And these are large examples, but it could be really scaled to whatever reason. And I'm going to talk about companies or organizations that took care of the left-hand side of the screen. They had backups. They didn't lose any data, but they didn't have the ability to get back up and running. And the first is San Francisco Metro Transit Authority. Black Friday 2016, they get hit with ransomware. And to their credit, they put out a statement immediately and said, we've been hit with ransomware. We got asked for $73,000 in ransom, but we have no intention of paying. And so, okay, well, what's going to happen? You're going to have to restore from your backup. Now, the issue was that the systems that were hit with their fare collection terminals. So they weren't able to collect fares on their light rail or their bus system. So they get their IT team together and say, how long are we going to be down? They said, we'll be back up and running Sunday morning. So they were looking at 2 days of not having the ability to collect fares. So the two options were, okay, we could just shut down the light rail and the bus system, which really isn't an option, especially on the two busiest days of the year, or door number two, which is give away free rides. And that's what they did. They gave away free rides for 2 days. So now it became a nice story. Everybody was happy they got the ride for free. And there wasn't any real follow-up stories looking at how much money they lost. But they do have a lot of information on their website that I'm able to do the math for them. And so they claim that they provide 735,000 rides every day. Probably number is probably higher, but let's just take their number. And it doesn't break down how many of those folks ride the bus or the light rail, but I do know it's $1 to ride the bus, $2.25 to ride the light rail. So they're down for 2 days. They lost anywhere between $1.5 and $3.5 million in lost revenue. And that's the math these criminals want to do. They could have paid the $73,000 and crossed their fingers and hoped that these were honest criminals and they gave the data back. Instead, they restored. It took them 2 days, and they lost several $1 million. And I actually was alongside another FBI agent in New York City earlier this year. He told the same story, stole my story, and he went ahead of me. So now I'm like, what am I going to present on? But he talked about, hey, he got to this point and didn't do the math. He goes, I don't know how much money they lost, but if it happened up here in Manhattan, we'd lose $50 million a day. It would have been $100 million to be down for 2 days. And the second example is actually more concrete. This is, I was alongside on a panel with a gentleman who was talking about cybersecurity insurance, which is another conversation for another day, but he's talking about the need for it. He gave an example of a utility company out in Lansing, Michigan. They're hit for $25,000. They had a very robust IT team, 51 employees just on their IT team. They said, we're going to be able to recover. So they spent a day trying to recover. And after a day, they decided, we're not getting this data back, we have to pay the ransom. So they set up a Bitcoin account, they go and pay the ransom, and even by doing that, they were down for a full week. And so they had cybersecurity insurance, so they put together a claim, and they estimated that the total cost of their downtime, the disruption, was $2.4 million. Now, once they put the claim together, they acknowledged that about $400,000 of that were system upgrades that they needed so they weren't attacked again. So their actual claim was $2 million. Now, they submitted it to an insurance company. They did, obviously, their vetting. The underwriters look at this. My experience with insurance companies is they don't tend to pay out on claims that aren't real. So they vet it, and they wound up cutting a check for $1.9 million. There was a $100,000 deductible. And so he's up there talking about this is the need for cybersecurity insurance, and I looked at it a different way. I looked at it as this is somebody third party validating that cost of downtime. This is exactly what we've been talking about. The $25,000 that they paid in ransom was much smaller than that cost of downtime. And they could absorb that because they're this large utility company, but for the most part, small businesses cannot. And that's the big threat that's out there. So what are we talking about when we're talking about taking that step back, that time machine to go back? Well, what virtualization would look like is if this represents your server and it gets hit with ransomware and you get that scary red screen, well, because everything that lived on that server lives on this on-premise device, we're able to spin up a virtual machine. It's a quick call to Ensero, and we're able to spin up a virtual machine. And now everyone that was operating off of that server is now operating off of this on-premise device. You're taking backups in this state so that it's truly a functioning production environment. And it might take you a week or a few weeks to get that new server in place or the old server wiped clean. Whenever that, you could be in this virtualized state for hours or days or weeks while you're getting that replaced. And then once everything's back up and ready to go, you do a bare metal restore and get all that data, including the changes that you made during that virtualized session, over to that new piece of hardware. And so now we're reducing the amount of downtime from, we're talking days or weeks down to hours or days, depending on the size of your systems. But trying to eliminate that downtime is very key. It's going to allow you to answer those RTO and RPO questions from that previous slide. Your RPO is your recovery point objective. How much data are you at risk of losing at any given time? Well, you're going to set your schedule to as aggressive as you'd like to make sure that you're taking backups as often as you need to, but we're actually also testing those backups. And we don't just test that the backups occurred and there's data there. We actually spin up this virtual machine every night in the background. We bring it up to a boot screen that shows here's the start screen, take a snapshot of it, send it over to Ansero and their team. So all these cool virtualization capabilities, able to roll back to your last clean backup, those are being tested every single day. So that when you come into work on Monday, if you're hit with ransomware, it's truly as simple as rolling back to your last clean backup. So if you're hit at noon and you take hourly backups, roll back to that 11 o'clock backup, and you're able to do these virtualization capabilities. And lastly, you could do this either from the local device or from either one of those data centers. So even if that on-premise device is compromised by a fire or a flood or another storm, you're able to do these same virtualization capabilities from either data center. I mean, the big test for us as a company was Hurricane Sandy. We're right on Long Island Sound. Most of our clients at that point were all on the East Coast. Hurricane Sandy came by. We had thousands of small businesses operating out of our data centers for weeks as their server rooms were being, drained out and put new racks in and all the rest. How many of those businesses wouldn't be in business today if they didn't have these virtualization capabilities? And so this is the way you combat these criminals. And this is the way that allows you to say, okay, if something were to happen, I can go back in time to where things were good, where all my data was there, and get these virtualization capabilities up and running. Everyone in the office is operating business as usual, and you're eliminating the threats of some of those things. And really the solutions you've got, it's very scalable. You've got small devices, the little ones that are 1 terabyte or below, all the way up to 120 terabytes. So the idea is it really does take a call into Ansero so they could look at your entire solution and make sure that it's the proper solution for your environment. It's not just a list of products. It's actually their custom. Every single one is built for your environment. And so what this allows you to do is take care of both of these pieces of leverage. Obviously, we're backing up your data. We're testing it. You know exactly how much data you're ever at risk of losing. But the virtualization capabilities takes care of that downtime, allows you to get back up and running. And so this is really critical. So, I highly encourage you to reach out to the folks at Ansero. Just let them come in and take a look at what you have and see, make sure that that you're, properly, adequately prepared for one of these attacks that were to occur. And so with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. I think we do have a couple questions coming in here. Let me open that. Okay, so you're talking about installing data into a brand new computer. Does it also include the operating system? And that answer is actually yes. So when we're talking about the backups, that's what that image base allows you to do. So the question is, are you just taking files and folders? And the answer is no. It's files, folders, operating systems, applications. It's that image-based solution that allows us to do those virtualization capabilities. And so that's a great question, and that's really one of the key components of this. Another question that's coming in, what is the typical recovery time objective for traditional backups? I wish I could answer that question, but they all vary. But I can tell you that typically, if you're looking at it, just an offsite backup, you're looking at several days, if not weeks. And it all depends on the size of your data, too. If you've got a small data set, you could probably restore relatively quickly. But, we all are very dependent on our data now. And so you're looking at, large sums of data that are able to be pulled down from either, an on-premise backup solution or an offsite backup solution. It's usually several days. And so our restoration process, once the system's ready to get restored, what we're able to do is, I mentioned that you're in the virtualized state, so you're up in that virtualized state, business as usual. You don't have to just now shut down and take several hours. It probably will take several hours on our solution depending on your data to get that data back, but we're able to start that restoration process while you're still in that virtualized state. So even on the back end, you're not absorbing very much downtime at all. It really is just a server reboot. And so the downtime on the front end is, we could really shorten it down to, as we mentioned, you to call Ensero, and within a few hours, all of your systems are back up and running. But on the restore process, we're able to start that while you're virtualized. And so that's a great question, and that's actually one that comes up very often. So I don't see, how many people that pay the ransom get their data back? That's a great question. I would say the first study, the one that I've been talking about, was about 75%. So 25% pay the ransom and never get their data back. I just was corrected at a presentation a couple weeks ago that the newest study is that it's down in the low 60s. So 62, 63%. So almost 4 in 10 that pay the ransom never get their data back. The idea that this is some honest business transaction where you just say, okay, I'm going to pay the ransom and get my data back, that's just not the case. As I mentioned, it takes several days to even set up a Bitcoin account, typically, if you don't have one. And so, yeah, these are bad guys out there doing some bad things, and so you have to be prepared. And they're always going to look at the low-hanging fruit, which unfortunately tends to be the small business community, because they're not prepared and because they can't absorb that downtime. They're at most risk, so they're going to go and they're going to attack those folks. Well, we're coming right up on the 11:40 end time, so I really appreciate everyone that joined us today. Hopefully it was informative to you guys. We're going to record it. Again, all the contact information for Ensero and their team are up on the screen right now. They're offering a free BDR assessment. Please take advantage of that. It's the only way you know whether what you have in place is adequate. And you'll be able to answer those RTO and RPO questions if you let them kind of come in and talk about that. And they're going to give you some tips that, obviously we couldn't cover within the 40 minutes. And if you want to see a more detailed demonstration of actually what this looks like, what those virtualization capabilities look like, reach out and we could do a one-on-one kind of demo as well. So with that, I want to thank everybody. This was fantastic, and any questions, feel free to reach out and to me or to Ensero and their team, and we could definitely get those answered. So thank you all very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.